Empathy is something we all want from others, which is a good sign that we should provide it to others, don't you think? And while you might have thought about the idea of being an empathetic leader, do you know how to do it? And so today you're going to get ideas on how to do that, but that's just half of our goal for today. What if we could engineer empathy into the fabric and culture of our organizations? Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? You are in the right place if you agree. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be live for future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all of those information about all those future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner. Yeah, by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Now, today's episode is brought to you by, as I mentioned before we started the podcast, by Virtual Leader Con. You can learn more about our 2-day Virtual Leader Con event, where I bring a number of over a dozen experts to join me for interviews just like this one. By the time you hear these words, it may have been past, but you don't want to miss the chance to go see what's there, get some free stuff, and learn more about how to be a part of virtualleadercon.com. Hope you'll do that. Now, without any further ado, let me bring in Dr. Nicole Price. She is our guest. And now if I can get my script back up here, I will read her intro. Here it is. Our guest today is Dr. Nicole Price. She is the Forbes Books author of Spark the Heart, Engineering Empathy in Your Organization. She is also the CEO of Lively Paradox, a professional coaching business that focuses on practicing empathy in leadership. Originally trained as an engineer, Dr. Price's technical background enhances her objective approach to solving process problems and helping people focus on solutions. Today, the solution being empathy. Nicole, welcome. So glad that you are here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
So here's the deal. No one gets on this show without me having a chance to look at their book. I mean, if they're an author. And so I make some decisions. We get lots more people that want to be on than we ever get on. And so I look at the book at first and decide, yeah, I want this person. Now, then I read the book before the person's actually here. So Nicole is well vetted by Kevin. The book is fabulous. We're going to talk about it. Spark the Heart. See all my little notes here along the side. So Nicole, I am so glad that you're here. And we're going to dive into the book here in just a second. There's a specific page I'm going to ask a question about. It's not a test, though, I promise. But what I want to do is have you tell a little bit about, like you say early in the book, and this may not be the words that you used, but you basically say, well, I was once the least empathetic person. And so can you tell us why you would say such a thing, first of all? And then let's talk a little bit about how you got from there to writing a book about empathy.
So can I first just say I'm embarrassed by that? I wish it weren't true, but engineering training teaches you to be less empathetic, actually. Kevin, if you can imagine that I'm trying to get, 200,000 parts out by the end of the week, and you can make those parts any kind of parts you want. If you get sick, Kevin, I need to be able to swap you out for somebody else.
And I still got to make 200,000 parts.
Because I still have to make 200,000 parts. And so the training, I think it's unintended, but absolutely causes you to design so that no single person can cause a break in the system. And so therefore you are thinking of people as cogs in the wheel. You are designing instruction for the least common denominator. And everyone has to bend to that. And we have good reasons for that. It's the reason why you can't put your battery in your car the wrong way. It's the reason why crashes and airplanes have gone way down. Pilots have not gotten better. We've made it such that they cannot do certain things. And while it keeps us safe, there are certain parts of it that lack a little bit of empathy and humanity.
So there's actually two things. There's all of your training that sort of maybe trained empathy out of you, but you also grew up in a household with a mother who you would maybe say is the most empathetic person ever, and that sort of didn't lead you to join her, at least initially. So we don't need to go into that, but it's a fascinating. I will tell you all, if you when you do get your copy of the book, when you if you read the first few paragraphs, read the first chapter, you won't put it down. I'm just telling you that right now. So my question is, how do you get from watching mom do one thing, getting it trained out of you later, if you will, at least in part? What's the turning point that brings you back to this idea? Hey, empathy matters.
Well, I'm grateful that you brought up my mother. She's a critical component of the story, which is why we opened it with her. Um, so I watched her and I thought she didn't have boundaries. Today I know that she did. She was choosing very carefully what she wanted to do, and she knew what she had capacity to say yes and no to. But what I remember in my younger view was that I thought people used her. I thought some of the people had been given far too many chances to get it right, and they still weren't getting it right. And she was in charge of the food ministry at the church, and she extended that into our actual house. And so if anybody stopped by, they could always get something to eat, and it didn't matter who that somebody was. And and some of these people just use all your biases and your imagination, are just the kind of people that eventually you would think they would figure out how to get it together. But my mother always felt like everybody had a spark of the divine in them. And so what I found myself doing was separating myself from that, because it did actually cause me quite a bit of anxiety, even though I wasn't the one who was involved. And I noticed that when I separated myself and said, what would I want to happen if it weren't me? What are people who are in Bangladesh thinking about this particular person's issue right now? They aren't. And I would use those strategies to help me separate myself from people. And then that separation did nothing but make me just like a relentless engineer when it was time to get those 200,000 parts out, because it didn't matter what a person said, really. I would listen. I knew better than to not listen, but my mind was thinking about who else.
200,000 parts is what you were thinking about.
Yes.
So on page 21 in the book, I promise there's not a question here that's like a test,
Okay.
but there's a pull out quote which is excellent, which I think will get us into where we're headed about empathy. And it says, anytime anyone has ever tried to get someone to understand them, they were seeking empathy. And I said that at the beginning, like we all want it, right? We don't always provide it. So like, let's use that. Any comments you want to make about that statement, first of all?
I remember when that idea came to me, someone was pushing back on the concept that empathy was what we need. And I had just remembered that person explaining something to me that I absolutely didn't understand. And I said, empathy cannot sit on this bed of hypocrisy that you're pushing down my throat right now. You just were trying to get me to understand XYZ just last week. And that's where that quote came from. When you are trying to invite someone into your way of thinking because they don't understand it, that is nothing more than trying to get them to empathize with you and your position. And if we can remember that, my hope is that then we will extend it to other people, recognizing that that's a hope.
Okay, so that in part, I mean, we're going to get in. There's all different stuff about empathy we're going to get to before we're done. But if in part that is empathy, then what isn't empathy? Which is probably where we need to do before we get really in depth here. Like, what are maybe some of the misconceptions, or what do people think empathy is that it really isn't?
Yeah, there are two that I want to cover. I cover quite a few in the book, but there's two that I get almost always. One is empathy is not necessarily kindness. When my mom passed away, many people stood up at her funeral and they talked about how she was just the nicest person ever. And you know what? I don't know that I would use the words nice or kind. I would use the word empathetic. She I mean, she didn't necessarily make people feel comfortable. She was thinking about what she would need if she were in their position. And sometimes that meant discomfort. But everybody, if they're hungry, needs food. I mean, there's a difference in that. Um, the other thing that I hear often is that empathy means agreement, because people will say, so you want me to empathize with, and they always go to some of the world's most fringe thoughts and ideas.
Like, I can't agree with that, so I can't be
I
empathetic.
can't empathetic. And I'm just, I'm like, I want you to empathize with Susie in accounting. I'm not trying to get you to empathize with someone who has a drastically different political view than you or something like that. Although I think there's space for empathy in that, in those arenas, we have to start in small ways, practicing, maybe even with our families, trying to understand each other. I do an exercise in one of my workshops around communication style and introversion and extroversion. And my goodness, you should see how much people don't understand each other just around how energy is expressed, whether it's internal or external. And when we were in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, all of a sudden we weren't in connection with each other. We're all in our individual homes, and we're on Zooms, and there's a lot less talking and getting together. And very quickly, people with introverted leadership tendencies started to put those as maybe like a dominant way of communicating, instead of remembering that it's both extroversion and introversion that are both necessary for the world to go around. As soon as introverts were in a position of power, they started to wield that power in the same ways that extroversion had been wielded against them. And that's what I'm trying to tackle here.
Right. So, okay, we're 10 minutes into our conversation here, and it's all sort of peacocks and roses, right? Of course, empathy is awesome and it's fantastic, and everyone wants to be understood. Like, we all agree with that.
Mhm.
Uh, but what's the business case? Is that, I mean, because really today, I said in the opening, we're going to talk about being more empathetic and tools for us to do that, but also, like, how do we put this in our organizations? So for us as a leader, or to have an organization with greater empathy in general, like, what's the business case? Why does this matter? Why should this matter to us, Nicole?
I like to talk about healthcare. I'm biased towards healthcare for some reason. I'm not really sure what, but I think it might be because I think people in healthcare should be empathetic. And that's why I think maybe why. That might be why. Who goes to the hospital or goes to see a healthcare institution if they're not in incredible need of someone understanding what position they're in physically to be able to help them in many cases? And the stat I like to talk about the most is if you have diabetes, the critical markers for whether or not you're getting well is your A1C number and your good cholesterol. Actually, if we can get your good cholesterol up and your A1C levels down, we can probably help your diabetes situation, keep your kidneys from failing, all the good things that keep us healthy and well. And most people would think that diet and exercise is directly tied to that. And I would say, yes, they are. And so is whether or not your physician is empathetic. There's almost a 20% difference for people with diabetes who have empathetic leaders than those who empathetic physicians than those who don't, in terms of how well they respond to their treatment plan on good cholesterol and A1C level.
Belief, encouragement, empathy, all those things, right?
And it takes a physician to understand what your lifestyle is, what your stress levels are, what your discipline level is, to be able to do things in order to be able to prescribe you something that will not only work, but that you'll do. Whereas
Exactly.
a non-empathetic physician is more likely to just give you, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much, move more, as we all need to do. And it wouldn't be differentiated and targeted. And the same is true for children in education. Empathetic teachers and leaders have better student outcomes. And for those of us who have ever worked for a leader who has lacked empathy, we generally
You already know, right?
yeah, I don't have to tell you what the business case is. I'll just ask you, what was your personal employee engagement like during that time?
Yeah, what was your engagement level like? What was your productivity like? What was your stress level like? We can go right on down the list, right?
How much time did you waste talking about that leader versus to them about productive things?
There you go. So in the book, a big piece of the book, big piece of the first half of the book, is you unpacking the different types of empathy. And we
Mhm.
don't have time here to unpack all of them. But you talk about affective, cognitive, compassionate, somatic, and radical empathy. I want to definitely talk about radical.
Okay.
But is there another one before we get to radical empathy that you would want to say, hey, I think this is one that perhaps I feel led to talk about today, or I think that leaders really need to hear about? Pick one.
Yeah, so I think cognitive or mental empathy would be the one I like to pick. But Kevin, it's not because I think it's the best one. It's because it's the one that's easiest to teach. When people think you can't learn empathy, the one they're thinking about probably is emotional or affective empathy. My ability to feel the emotions of other people. You don't have to be empathic to do that, but it does take a while to be able to build those muscles. But for me, Kevin, to hear you tell me about what your life is like, to have you describe it to me, if you and I work together, if I try hard enough, I can think about, if let's say you tell me that you're frustrated by something. I can remember a time when I was frustrated and then try to imagine what you're thinking. And I can teach people to do that by just getting them to practice doing it. We just don't even practice doing it. Kevin, if you get frustrated with me, my natural tendency is to say, well, he shouldn't be frustrated. I don't understand why he's
There's no
frustrated.
reason for him to be
There's
frustrated with
no
me.
reason for him to be frustrated. Instead of going, what could be all the reasons why Kevin is
Yeah.
frustrated with me, and answering those questions, and then going, when I'm frustrated, how do I want people to handle me? And it's likely not sending me a 13th email.
Oh, and oh, by the way, so I'm going to go back to that because I use this strategy in my own head all the time. And I use this strategy when I'm coaching all the time. Like, what are the plausible reasons people would do this? What are the plausible reasons? Like, we might not even come up with the right one, but the
Right.
fact that we come up with a bunch of them says, oh, there's a lot more to this than I
Mhm.
initially thought with my thought, right? Or my
That's
belief about it, right? So it's so very, very powerful. And I love that that's the one you picked, actually. And yet, we eventually get to this thing that you're calling radical empathy, which you asked me before we went live, what should the title of the book been? Perhaps that's what it should have been, actually. So what do you mean by radical empathy?
I meet people every day, including myself, who are actually quite empathetic at this point in their lives. And yet, when you ask them to be empathetic towards someone who is quite different from them, they start to, you can't hardly recognize that they have empathy muscle. And radical empathy is being able to transition all of those skills and competencies that you've learned from an empathetic standpoint and say, you know what? I happen to be a faith filled person, and I am going to do what I can to try to understand someone who doesn't believe in any deity at all. And what I usually get pushed back on, and I don't know why I use that example because that's probably the one that's the hardest for people to do it with, is that people are more like, I just don't understand. Like, how could you look at the mountains and the ocean and not see some being in that? It's like, well, that's whenever you say, I just don't understand, I want you to try. Because in that space of understanding, that's where we know what our next right action should be. Even if we're tackling some of the world's most difficult problems, and even if we're dealing with people who if you think someone should be committed and never see the light of day again, I bet you can make that decision swifter if you understood them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, um, we're talking about empathy. We're talking with Dr. Nicole Price. Came in late, the author of the new book Spark the Heart, Engineering Empathy in Your Organization, which is where I want to go next. like we could have a long conversation about empathy and how do we build those skills for ourselves, build the empathy muscle, as you just mentioned a second ago. And yet I promised at the outset and that we would, and even in the title, that we would go beyond that. So that's what I want to do now. I want to talk about, well, before we do that, even like I know we said earlier on a personal level why empathy matters, and we talked about the business case a little bit, but now we're talking about this sort of organizationally. And so I want to get at how do we create this in our organizations? But again, I wanted to take, is there anything else besides that doctor patient piece, leader individual piece? Like if we become a more empathetic organization, how will our organization and our mission benefit from that?
It's a question that I like to ask my clients. I don't like to answer it for them. I like for them to tell me, what do you think are the benefits to you, to your leadership team, to the person who's responsible for facilities and food service, if they understood every single stakeholder just a little better, understood what motivated them from an emotional standpoint, understood what they were thinking, feeling, and believing. When you see any kind of marketing success story, it is because they are empathetic to people.
Yeah.
And some of the world's most evil characters understand empathy. They use it for bad. They go, let me figure out how to manipulate. This is using those same tactics, but having emotional intelligence and care and concern for people underneath it. And so, Kevin, I often will say, I'm just trying to talk to people who I feel like are better people than me, to get them to use some strategies that we know work to make their organizations better, which then in essence makes things better for people, which then makes our communities better. People are just stressed and taking it from all these different angles. And whose responsibility is it to at least decide we're going to try to fix it? And I even used to be one of those people who would say, that's HR. Like HR needs to worry about that kind of thing. Or, where's the employee assistance program? Like, where are those people? Like, if you came to my office with one of those things, man, I had my paperwork ready to get you out of my office and off to where you needed to be, because that was not my lane.
I got 200,000 parts to make this.
I have 200,000 parts to get out of here.
I'm actually guessing that if people are still with us this far in, that they at some level get this point, right? That this is important. So the question is, if we want to sort of put this in our culture, if we want to engineer empathy in our organizations, what do we need to be doing? Other than hiring you, Nicole, what do we need to be doing? She goes, step one, hire me. But the next thing is, like, what do we need to be doing here? What can you give us a couple of pieces of advice to get us started?
Interestingly enough, I don't think people need to hire me. I put the entire playbook in this book, right? They can just buy the book and follow the simple instructions. But what I will invite people to do is think about one policy that you have that you recognize is not fair to the people. For whatever reason, it could be, you could have created these policies for great reasons. And I know, Kevin, that I have a particular interest in bereavement policy. Like, I do not think it is fair. I don't think it centers people first. And I think we've got some work to do there. And I think it's pretty simple to implement. But I invite people to think about what policies they have in place that they know don't work for people. Let me give you a specific example.
I was going to say, like, you can't just bust out that and then move on. So tell us a little more about that.
I'll give you a specific example in schools, and then I'll give you another example in industry. In schools, children who are late to school consistently end up getting detention. And then if you get enough detentions, then you get suspended. And if you get enough suspensions, then you get expelled. What students are mostly going to be late to school consistently?
The ones who most need to be there for lots of reasons, right?
The ones who most need to be there, typically, not always, they happen to be impoverished. When you ask anybody what might make you late for school, if you happen to be impoverished, things like getting my utilities turned off, I might have to get another kid to school, I don't have a ride, we had a flat, any
Yeah.
number of things in rural communities. I had to do some farm work beforehand and I didn't get it done in time. And so I missed. All of these things are not reasons to further discipline a child. We've got to find a different way. And I think that different way looks different if you're in a urban school district versus a rural school district versus a suburban school district. But we have to find a better way. Do not further punish students who are already on the fringes of society being mistreated. So that's a school example. Now, I worked in manufacturing for years, and some of our employees had to be at work at 7:30 because the line started at 7:30. If some people were there at 7:35, we'd be having parts not going where they needed to go. Things would be piling up. We'd have waste of waiting. But can you tell me why the finance clerk needs to be there at 7:30? And if the policy is that the finance clerk has to be there at 7:30 because everybody else is there at 7:30, I need us to look at that.
100%.
I need us to look at that, especially if, and this was my case, most of the people who are working in manufacturing, 28 years on average, don't have any little kids. Finance clerk has a little kid. Daycare doesn't open till 7. It's just.
And the point is, it doesn't matter, right? This is the unintended consequence of policies.
Right.
That's why I love your question. And so people say, well, why hasn't she given us 41 things to try? No, this one thing. Pick a policy. No one writes policies to mess them up, but
No.
yet most of them are messed up when it's all
Yes.
said and done. And so the reality is, let's look at one now, and let's bring our team together. If you're a leader of a team, like, what's one thing that we're doing? May not even be a policy, but for us on our team, like, what's getting in our way that wasn't intended?
Right.
Right.
Right. And I don't want people to think that I have any position about the use of marijuana, because I don't. I can think of positives and negatives about using marijuana. And when we do sobriety tests at work, it's about whether or not a person is drunk in that moment. And if I smoked marijuana a month ago and I have an accident today, I'm going to test positive for marijuana. And most people's policies are going to fire me because I used marijuana a month ago. And my question would be, let's say this is a bus driver at a school district who hasn't used marijuana for a month. They clearly are not high. You can't get bus drivers. And now you've started the recruitment process all over again because of a policy that, listen, I might be against marijuana use. I might be against alcohol use. But if I used alcohol a month ago, you wouldn't fire me.
First of all, you have no way of knowing,
There's
right?
no way of knowing. And so we need some kind of sobriety test for marijuana because these policies have not caught up with the legislative changes that we have in certain states. And I just want to double down. I don't have an opinion about whether or not people should or should not use marijuana. My point is more, how's that policy working for you when we're having a talent war, people are quiet quitting, and you've got loud laborers, and you've got all these things. And now you have a policy that's preventing you from keeping good talent. I worked in one of the nation's largest creative organizations. They would have never done random marijuana tests because they know what it would have done to the workforce. And I just invite us in those situations to pull people together, set aside our own agendas for a moment, and see if we can come up with something that's more equitable for all the people on our team.
So, Nicole, before we move into the last section of this conversation, is there a question I didn't ask that either you thought I would or that you wish I would have asked?
Well, you didn't ask me why I wrote this book.
I didn't. I mean, people might have been able to infer it a little bit, but you want to go ahead and answer that question?
You know what, Kevin? I was spending most of my life trying to get difference to get along, focused on inclusion and equity inside organizations. And one day someone said to me, I understand why my organization should be inclusive. I was basically hoping you were going to help me get it emotionally. Like, this doesn't impact me when I'm at home. And that was my indicator Because empathy can be found in every book I've ever written. It can be found in every workshop I've ever delivered. I've never thought that I should be the one writing a book about it. And someone said that, in fact, it was my personal pastor who said, there's nobody better than you because you were not born this way. You had to learn it the hard way. And so I stopped resisting that urge and I said, I'm going to speak to people who struggle with this concept. This is not about becoming a social worker. Empathy is not the enemy of productivity. This is not about holding hands and singing kumbaya and not holding people accountable. This is, I am going to be smarter and able to do all of those things because I'm empathetic. And that's why I wrote this book. I didn't see it in the landscape.
Yeah, and we are talking with Dr. Nicole Price, the author of this really, really wonderful book, Spark the Heart, Engineering Empathy in Your Organization. And as I told her before we started, I think it needs a different title, and she agreed with me. And you'll notice that the title of the episode is the subtitle of the book. And I think that that's really been where we've gone in this conversation. So, but before we go, I've got 3 or 4 more questions for you, Nicole, as we shift gears here, and we are literally shifting gears. So the question is, Nicole, what do you do for fun?
I like comedy shows. One of my top 3 values is humor. That gets me in trouble, by the way. Sometimes it doesn't land how I want it to. But if I can get to a comedy show and laugh, that's going to be considered a good day, or be with children and their funny senses of humor.
All right. And what are you reading? I mean, if you all are watching, or live you are obviously, but if you're listening later, you could be watching later. And if you're watching, you can see there's books behind her on the shelf. What are you reading these days?
Yeah, so my personal therapist told me to stop reading so much of this kind of stuff that's behind me on the shelf and to lean into some fiction, which fiction is a beautiful way to build empathy if you want to learn about a group that you don't know much about. And so I am actually reading the series, The Children of Blood and Bone, right now. It's a fiction book, and it is an absolute page turner. And I'm learning a lot about decision making and courage and moving forward when you don't know if you can trust your team members, but you need to be successful. And it's a fiction book, and I love it.
The Children of Blood and Bones. And so we will have the information about that in the show notes for you, everybody. So, Nicole, now the question you wanted me to be asking from the very beginning, like, where can we learn more? Where do you want to point people? How can they get connected with you? However you want to go with that.
Yeah, so all my social channels, my handle is Dr. Nicole Price, and the website has the same name, drnicoleprice.com. And if you want to send me a personal email, you can send it to Nicole at drnicoleprice.com. It is really that simple. If you are interested in a workshop, well, you're like, I don't want to teach this to people, I want you to come and teach it to people, just change that to info at drnicoleprice.com. And we just finished our Empathy 14. Every year we do 14 days worth of empathy together. You can do it anytime though. And it's just simple little on-the-job exercises. It's not really difficult, that you can do for 2 weeks to help build your empathy muscle. And I invite you to join us on those if you want to. We'll do them next August 1st through the 14th. But if you're interested, it's laid out completely in the book each day.
Right there in the back of the book. They certainly are. So now a question for all of you who are watching or listening, and that is, now what? What action will you take as a result of this conversation? Hopefully you found this useful, interesting, perhaps even inspiring. But nothing will matter unless you take some action, because nothing's going to change unless you do something. So the real question from this conversation is, what will you take from it? What will you do as a result? Answering that question, now what, is the single best thing you can do right now to take this from being something that you enjoyed and found interesting to have it being a way to impact your work and your life. And I hope that you will do exactly that. So, Nicole, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. It really, truly was. And everybody, if you're here for the first time, I hope it's not the last time. And if you're not here the first time, you know that we're here every week. So I hope you'll come back and join us. on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, wherever you happen to listen to them. And if you love what you've experienced here, then I want you to strongly consider going to virtualleadercon.com to learn more about what we're doing there. This year, it will just have passed if you're listening to the podcast when it first comes out. But whenever you're listening, you can always go to virtualleadercon.com to get some free stuff and see all about what we're doing, how we're helping leaders around the world by bringing them the very best leadership thought leaders in a virtual way. And you can even get the recordings of past events. Hope you'll do that. Virtualleadercon.com. Hope you come back here for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, because we're here every week, and we hope you'll be back with us next week. Thanks, everybody.